So, hello and welcome back as we delve yet again into my recap of The Phoenix Transformed by Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory, the final book in the Enduring Flame trilogy, which is not really necessarily like the end of the books set in this universe, but it's the end of the books that I know well of the books set in this universe. I have at least one that is deals with the events of the very first in Darkened War. I It was one of those that I started reading and it just didn't hook me. I need to find it. It's probably upstairs somewhere and kind of reread it and see if I like it better. But it was one that I didn't finish and I don't know why. It's weird how that happens, you know. Sometimes you start a book and you're going great with it and you set it down for one reason or another and you just never finish it. I need to find it again. But anyway, we spent our last chapter with Tercel summoning up the Fire Crown, learning that the Fire Crown has a bargain for him. The Fire Crown also has a bargain for Aniran, and neither person really knows. Well, that's not true. Actually, Tercel doesn't know that the Fire Crown has a bargain going with Aniran, but the Fire Crown did quite blatantly tell Aniran exactly what he told Tercel. Uh, it feels kind of like the Fire Crown is playing both sides, or maybe just playing Tercel, but keeping in mind that a greater power is kind of above and beyond both the dark and the light. It's sort of its own crazy entity. We'll just have to wait and see what it's doing. But that did mean that Tercel went and told Harrier that he called up the Fire Crown and that they all need to head south again, even though that was not the intention. But that seems to be what is happening, because at the end of the last chapter, basically it sounds like the Fire Crown has put the Lake of Fire back where it was. How exactly it's done that, who knows? It is a greater power. It probably has a lot of magic at its command. But Harrier, seeing that the Lake of Fire is burning yet again, along with everything that the Isvai left behind, has decided yeah, that looks like that's what they're going to have to do. So now we just have to see what happens next as we jump back into chapter 18 of A Phoenix Transformed by Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory. And chapter 18 is titled A Stone of Flame. So, yeah, like I said, Harrier has decided that yeah, if the Lake of Fire is going again, that probably means that everything Tercel said is correct. And as he's looking over at the burning on the horizon, he asks Tercel, "What exactly did the Fire Crown say to you? Exactly?" And Tercel thought, and he says, "Entice Aniran back to its place of power, and it would make that ready to receive her, and Aniran would be dealt with in a fashion pleasing to us." He does amend that, oh, well, actually, the Fire Crown told him that Aniran would be dealt with in a fashion pleasing to him, but that was, pretty much what he said. He does not tell Tersa or Harrier about the whole dragon-bound mage giving up his life thing, but he's like, yeah, that's exactly what it said. And Harrier's like, okay, I guess that's what we're going to have to do. And he tells Tercel that Tercel has a very, very important task ahead of him. Tercel asks what that task is, and Harrier says it's to keep Shariah from killing me when we go tell her that we all have to turn around and head south again. They go and have a little conference with Shariah, who does seem to be quite put out about this whole thing. She says, "You believe that this will work?" "I believe that Tercel says that the Fire Crown said that it would do it," said Harrier. "Surprise!" he told Biso-Chim, who was in the vicinity. "You woke up a god." "It's a great power," Tercel amended. "Which explains why it never did anything you wanted it to, because great powers are like goats and the wild magic," Harrier added in an undertone. Harrier lays out his newly amended plan to Biso-Chim and Shariah, and honestly anybody in the vicinity that is close enough to hear, which is pretty much all of the remaining leaders of the Isvani, and that is that they would all head south, and then once they get to Abi-Abadashar, everybody except for Tercel, Harrier, Biso-Chim, and Saravase, and maybe Shariah, would all go into Abi-Abadashar and stay there while he and the rest go to the Lake of Fire and deal with an iron. This is his new grand plan. Tercel doesn't really think that that's going to work, but you know, he's willing to at least try. And Harrier kind of brushes off Tercel's concerns, but Harrier points out, when you come right down to it, we have three choices. 1, we ignore the Fire Crown's offer, and we all stay here, all of us. If we do that, sooner or later, Aniran will get bored, and I don't think that we will like that. 2, we ignore the Fire Crown's offer. Some of us stay here, some of us try to get a warning to the Elven lands. I know that I said we were going to Arameth, but that was before I talked to Helifin, who is the magistrate, and Lord Felocan and the others. I don't think that that's going to work now. Aniran will kill anyone that we leave behind. Shariah points out that that would be an acceptable loss if they knew that the warning would actually make it into the Elven lands. And Harrier tells her, "You're right, it would be an acceptable loss, but they probably won't make it. And even if a warning gets through, I am not sure that the Elven Queen would send help to take, I'm not sure that she would send help, so we're not going to take that chance." So that leaves our third choice. Believe what the Fire Crown told Tercel, which means we go back to the Lake of Fire, but we don't all go back to the Lake of Fire. If everybody is at Abi-Abadashar, they won't be standing at the edge of the Lake of Fire waiting for Aniran to just push them in, assuming that the Fire Crown is either lying or a little slow with his whole binding thing. And it's going to be really hard for us to even get that far, so the fewer people we travel with, the faster we'll go. It seems like a great plan, kind of, except everybody has their own points. Magistrate Parazel, Helifin, she is like, I don't think that's really going to work. And she starts chasing Harrier around, telling him all of her grand plans, which aren't even actually delineated in the chapter. We can assume that they're just probably a little bit silly. Tercel tells Cave to come with him. They seem to be making actually pretty good friends, which isn't surprising considering Cave is basically what Tercel would have been after getting out of university, so they have a lot in common. Cave and Tercel go around and kind of tell all of the Isvide what happened with the earthquake And Cave, it turns out, actually wanted to study natural history so he can tell all of the Isvi people, all of the things that happen during and after an earthquake and things like that. They keep on going, and now the sun is beginning to come up, and Saravase calls them all up to see a spectacular sight, and that is the sunrise is just kind of blood red. This scares all of the Isvi people, but thankfully Cave is able to tell them that evidently way out there at the Lake of Fire, which they haven't exactly told everyone that they're going back to yet, probably what happened was the Fire Crown made a volcano erupt. That kind of makes sense, and it's kind of hilarious because Saravase says that she's actually seen one, and among the elves it's called and I am going to try my best to say this word. I think it's kind of funny that it's only printed out in the book 2 times because I don't know how anyone says this word, including the Isvi people who give it a shortened name. But Tehuko Ia Hazarashatiel. I like volcano better. I'm going to spell this word for you just so that you can see how, or actually, I'm just going to see if I can show it to you on screen. And then I'll spell it for you. This is what I mean when I say sometimes I wonder if authors literally just smack the keyboard a couple times and then throw some vowels in, because this is the most ridiculous word, I think, in this series and possibly even in the Obsidian trilogy. It is spelled TEHUKAHIAZARISHTIAL. I really want to hear either James Mallory or Mercedes Lackey say that word. So, Tercel decides to shorten that big mouthful into Tuchuko, which is at least slightly easier to say. Anyway, Saravase tells them basically what happens when a volcano erupts, and Cave, seconds that. She lets them know that she's seen a volcano. I'm not even going to try and call it a Tuchuko. She has seen one of those erupt before in her lifetime, and what happens is the boiling rock from the ground bursts up through the mountain and spews ash and rock and all sorts of things into the air. The Isvani people have never even heard of a volcano, but they can see what happens. And Cave reassures them that the sky is red, not because there's blood, not because it's an omen of doom, but just because of all the ash that's in the sky. It's not quite more than the Isvi people can bear, but they're getting very tired of this. I don't think they bargained for anything like this when Bisochim sat them all down and told them all of his lies. But they're dealing with it. Harrier looks up at the sky, listens to the explanations about the smoke in the air and the Tuchuko, and he's also kind of over it. He says, "Great. So in addition to anything that a Nyran might want to do to us as we are along our way, we need to march south through as much smoke as a grass fire and cross some rivers of molten rock as we go?" Tercel lets him know, maybe not the rivers of molten rock, but yeah, we're going to have to walk through all this smoke. Once the Tichuco began to burn, no one could manage the jaw-breaking mouthful of, and I'm not even going to say that word again, so everyone used the abbreviated form of that Tressel had named it. But once it began, the light had a brassy yellow look to it, as if the desert were always on the verge of a sand wind. At night the moon, as yellow as a gold coin, was alone in the sky, and the smell of smoke was everywhere. On the third day after the appearance of the Tichuco, flecks of ash began to rain down over the oasis and surrounding the desert like warm gray snow. Every day that followed, everyone spent as much time sweeping ash off of every possible surface with the hastily fashioned brooms as they did getting ready to leave. Bisochim's wards couldn't keep it out. The ash was fine and soft, and it swirled in choking eddies like dust. It only added more work to days that were already overfull, for there were 1,000 things that had to be done before they could head south. Harrier is quite worried about what they're going to have to do. He's worried about what Anirin is going to toss at them. And Tressel wasn't there when they got ready and left the Lake of Fire and headed north. So he's sort of at a loss for what Harrier is trying to get ready. Tressel hadn't been there when the Isvani had left Telenchitel. But from the way everyone was talking, this departure was much the same. Only this time they had a better idea of what they were facing, so Harrier had Bisochim spell ward all the food supplies while the Isvani stripped the oasis of everything remotely edible. Every goat and sheep that they had was slaughtered and eaten. All of the surplus shotars were butchered and their meat was dried. Surplus tents were turned into carrying bags, clothing, and weapons, and basket upon basket was filled with root stocks and wet earth so the Isvai could plant food for the Shotars to browse at need. So, in a way, this time, maybe the journey will be easier because now they know what they're facing. But do they really? And at last, 10 days after the Lake of Fire began to burn in the south once more, they were ready to leave the oasis. And so, 10 days after the sign in the sky that the Fire Crown promised, they head south. They are hoping that they can get there, in a couple of moon turns, a couple of months. Then hopefully they can at least get to Abi Abadashar, and all of the Isbai people who will not be venturing forth to the Lake of Fire can be safe. And then, another couple of moon turns after that, they should be able to get to the Lake of Fire. Tercel's like, all right, so 3 to 5 months before we get to the Lake of Fire and actually do what Tercel is not looking forward to doing, but is at least hoping Anirin will be bound for. And so they go along. After 3 days of marching, Harrier realizes that this is not going to be the same type of journey. This isn't working, said Harrier. His robes, bright blue when they had left the oasis, were gray now with rubbed-in ash. Everyone's were. Everything was covered in ash. The air was filled with it any time the wind blew, and the wind blew constantly now. It was next to impossible not to breathe it. They were using up insane amounts of water because everyone kept the front of their chadars damp in a hopeless effort to keep the ash out of their noses and mouths, and they used up even more water washing out the noses of the shotars and their remaining dogs 2 or 3 times a day. Tercel thinks to himself that, this is absolutely insane. And I thought I could go south by myself, thought Tercel. I must have been crazy. Of course, he had not known what the Tchuco would be like. No one could have predicted that. They had now been traveling south for almost a month. And in that time, they had lost over 1,000 people. Not all just to the fact that they're breathing in ash, which can't really be healthy, but also because Aniran keeps sending things to attack them, because that's what she does. They've been attacked by a bunch of different things, and they're all tired. And they're traveling through an ashfall that seems constant. And probably a few other things. I'm trying to think of all the things that happen when a volcano erupts. At least they're not, dealing with acid rain, but they are dealing with just constant ash. Tercel asks Harrier, so what do you suggest? We can't turn back. And Harrier's trying to figure out what to do. I mean, he doesn't really know. Harrier's brother Eugene's is like, we're gonna die before we ever get there, aren't we? And Harrier's like, I don't know. And suddenly Tercel has an idea. Now, Tercel hasn't had many ideas other than calling up the Fire Crown in a while. And Tercel says, wait, Harrier, why do we have to take the Dove Road where Aniran knows where we're coming and can put all of her creatures in our way? And Harrier looks at him and he's like, because we need water, and Bisochim has put, wells all along this way like a couple of years ago. Tercel knew that there were still nearly 6,000 people in their caravan. They had talked about what lay ahead, especially once they had seen what they faced. In the Izvai, Bisochim could still call up a night spring onto the surface of the desert and have the water be drinkable once they strained the ash out of it. But in the Barileth, with its salt flats and what Cave had told them would be a much thicker layer of ash, any water that Bisochim might call up would be foul beyond the ability to use immediately. They would have to rely on the stone-lined deep wells along the Dove Road. Tercel looks over at Harrier and he's like, no, but listen, what if it was raining? For, the whole time that we were headed to the Lake of Fire. We wouldn't need to take the Dove Road then. We could catch rainwater to drink, and we wouldn't have to worry about how hot it was in the Barileth because it would always be raining. That's really stupid, Harrier said. Can you do that? He asked Bisochim. Make it rain here, now, and keep it raining for the next 3 moon turns till we get to the Lake of Fire? Everybody turns and looks at Bisochim, who's kind of just standing there, and he says, I must. I will. And he walked away. Harrier apologizes to Shariah for the insult that they are about to bring to her beloved desert by who knows how much rain, but Bisochim calls the rain. And there's immediately a problem with it because it's rain that is falling through a upper atmosphere layer of ash. And Eugene's and Harrier and everybody looks out and they're like, wait, we're supposed to drink this? It's sludge. Cave lets them know that eventually it will become drinkable. Just not quite yet. And they move on again. The one advantage to the rain that both Harrier and Eugene's, his brother, agreed on was that it would put an end to the drifts of ash that were flying everywhere, but as they found out when the Isvani finally emerged from their tents around the third hour of day, when rain soaked down a month's worth of ashfall. Ash became a grease slick. Worse yet, a grease slick overlay on the desert floor. And worse, the rain softened the hardpan so that the sharp tent pegs slipped loose and almost all the tents were sagging and half of them collapsed. And that was only the beginning of their newest problems. And their newest problems involve the fact that the Isvani people have never actually seen the rain, except the one time that Bisuchim made it rain way back at the Lake of Fire. They don't really know what to do with the rain, and there's 1,000 tiny annoyances. The Isvani tents aren't waterproof. The fires won't stay lit. The desert robes were designed to keep their wearers warm at night, but they weren't designed to keep anyone warm when they're wet, because it's the desert and it doesn't rain there. And also that Aniran is taking advantage of the fact that they were blind at night and hobbled during the day, and getting attacked with shamblers, black dogs, more goblins, sandwalkers. And in the Sen night, which I think is approximately a week after the rain begins, they lost another 1,000 people. Harrier has yet another one of his meetings, and Harrier's like, all right, well, so far I think Tercell's plan's working. Eugens is like, you have got to be kidding, Harrier. And Harrier's like, no, really. Bisuchim is making it rain, and I am taking us directly to Abi Abadashar, which, I mean, that might confuse Aniran, and it'll definitely get us there faster than if we were following the road and then jogging off to the west. Everybody asks Harrier, I know we've covered this before, but if we go straight to Abi Abadashar, aren't we going to be leading Aniran there? And Harrier tells everyone yet again that Abi Abadashar seems to be warded against any sort of demonic magic, so, it's gonna be all right. We also find out, as Harrier is telling all of the Isvai people about, hopefully, the fact that they'll be at Abi Abadashar much sooner than they thought, that Liafa, Shariah's grandmother, is actually still alive. She is now the oldest Isvai in existence, and he's really hoping that she makes it to Abi Abadashar because Harrier has become very fond of her. It goes a little bit more with the traveling, with all of the terrible things that traveling through desert that has ash falling and now constant rainfall. And Harrier kind of thinks as they're going. And this is actually the end of the chapter. This was one of the shorter chapters, but I'm going to read the entire last couple of pages because it kind of lets us in on Harrier's mind. But if Harrier were miserable, it was nothing to how the Isvani were suffering in the abruptly changed climate. At least he was used to rain, if not hot rain. They weren't. They bore it with the same stoic patience with which they had suffered every other hardship since they had set out from the Lake of Fire that first time. Usually Harrier didn't think about whether the people around him were comfortable or not, but it was different when it was Shariah. He had never meant to fall in love with her. He had never meant to fall in love at all, at least not for a really long time, and he still wasn't quite sure that he had, or how he had. What he felt for Shariah didn't seem much like what Eugens or his brother Kralt or Brelt had described. When his brother had arranged to marry Nadina Korolin after walking out with her for 2 years, or anything else. But Harrier knew that at least his brother's wives were all local girls. Shariah was, well, she was the Umari of the Nalzindar, an Isvani tribe that lived halfway to the Horn. Harrier could no more imagine bringing Shariah home to Gridiron Row than he could imagine flapping his arms and flying. Of course, Harrier wouldn't be going home to Gridiron Road himself. He had met Shariah at least partly because he was a wild mage, and wild mages didn't live on Gridiron Road. Harrier remembered a time when the thought of paying mage prices terrified him. Since then, he had paid out more of them than he could fairly remember. Small ones, like slaughtering a goat for the dog's dinner one night and chopping the meat up all by himself. Strange ones, like not entering any tent where Faunus was for 8 days and never saying why. Bizarre ones, like walking all of one day from sunup to sundown instead of riding. They had all become an ordinary part of his life, just a thing he did, and he swore and snarled at the wild magic the way the Isvani swore and snarled at their Shotars, and he complained to it and about it the way his ma complained at his da. Well, all the while, the wild magic had been becoming a part of him, like his hands or his sight, and it was hard to remember not being a part of it. But there was still one unpaid mage price hanging over his head. He remembered what Kerta had said very clearly. But since you cast such a non-specific spell and let me choose whether or not to answer, you get to choose your price. Either come away with me now, tonight, before sunrise, or later, at a time not of your choosing. You must give up the one thing you value most in the world. Of course he hadn't gone with her. He had still been afraid of the wild magic then. He wondered now what would have happened if he had. But he had made the choice he made, and that meant sometime soon he would have to give up the thing he most valued in the world. It had never been his life. Not since he had known what the stakes were, anyway. He had wondered for a while if what he was going to have to give up was Tercell's life, but that had never really made sense. He couldn't give up something that wasn't his. For the last couple moon turns, Harrier had started to worry that what he was going to have to give up was Shariah, and again he wondered how you could give up something that wasn't actually yours. But from the moment he had stood on top of the wall and looked south to see the fires glowing against the night sky, he had known that no matter how crazy Tercell's plan was, he had to go along with it. Because in the back of his mind, he had become aware that Kerta's mage price would be the last one he would ever pay. And a small voice was whispering, "Soon, soon." Harrier and Shariah talk for a little while, and Shariah asks Harrier a question that he didn't really ever think about, and that is, how do we know that Alkindar is actually gone? Has anyone directly asked Tercell? Would Tercell tell anybody if Alkindar was back? Harrier stared at her, knowing that he looked stunned. It made a terrible type of sense to him. Bisochim was a dragon-bound wild mage, and Bisochim had not been able to hurt Aniran. Tercell had been trained by Ankeldar to fight demons, but without the dragon bond, Tercell couldn't manage to do any of the spells that he knew. But if he had Ankeldar, Tercell and Ankeldar and Bisochim and Saravase could probably obliterate Aniran. That was how the mages had destroyed the Indarkand, high and wild magic working together. But Harrier did not want to believe that Tercel might have access to Ankildar and wasn't telling anyone because they had lost 1,565 people to Aniran who wouldn't have had to die if Tercel could have saved them. I really hope that Ankildar's not back, Harrier told Shariah. But he wasn't sure. And that is where the chapter ends, with Harrier facing yet another terrible suspicion about Tercel that I think if he weren't so miserable and half-starved, he probably wouldn't have even entertained for a minute. I think it's only his exhaustion that's kind of letting him even think that maybe Tercel could have Ankildar back and not tell them. But hopefully this time, this suspicion won't be allowed time to fester. Well, we kind of know it won't be allowed time to fester because there's only a couple of chapters left. In fact, I think our next chapter is 19, which is a fairly long one. There's either only 2 chapters left or maybe 3. I have to actually look. These are long chapters. All right, we've got chapter 20 still. Oh my gosh, I think we might only have 2 chapters left, guys. Yep, because chapter 20 is just a whopping long one, but we only have 2 chapters left of this book, so everything's going to be wrapping up this next week, which is kind of insane. And then I'm probably going to take a break from doing book recaps, at least for a little while. Well, I try and work out maybe a better format of doing them, or maybe compacting it down a little bit and doing like book reviews instead of big long recaps. I don't know. I need to figure out the format a little bit better, but in the meantime, we still have 2 chapters left of this book. So thank you as always for listening to me ramble, and yeah, I will see you next time. Don't forget to hit thumbs up on your way out if you don't mind. It does always make me smile, and I will see you next time.